Welcome back, everyone. So now we're talking about Autism Speaks once more. There's a lot to talk about with them. The early 2010s saw an uptick of protests against them, often being organized by Asan chapters. A few of the activists pictured here in particular really got their start during this era. You can see Sarah Luderman, an autistic journalist on the left, holding a sign that says, "You're perfect just the way you are." And on the right, Lydia Brown is holding a sign with picture symbols that resemble an AAC app. Emily Titan is also pictured here with Lydia. Emily's been involved with the movement since the early days. A blog called Boycott Autism Speaks was also started, which was a way of spreading the word on the harms this organization was doing and still does. Boycott Autism Speaks is run by several volunteers. They haven't been as active in the past few years, but that doesn't mean the people behind it have changed their minds. There were a lot of smaller scale boycotts against companies that donated to them during this time. Some of them were successful. Activists were able to convince Build-A-Bear Workshop to cut their ties, and good on them. I have fond memories of going there as a kid. I haven't been there in a while. If I go again, it'll probably be for one of their Pokemon. Here is possibly the most well-known campaign Autism Speaks started, the Light It Up Blue. This was started in 2011 as a way of bringing awareness to autism. It's very reminiscent of the pink from Susan G. Komen, which I believe I've stated in previous videos that Autism Speaks is functionally similar to. Both of them are large charities with representations of major corporations in their leadership and on their board of directors. They chose blue because autism is supposedly more present in boys, which is an ongoing falsehood that has made it harder for any autistic person who isn't male to receive a diagnosis. In their documentary Sounding the Alarm Battling the Autism Epidemic, Suzanne Wright talks about their process in choosing the color blue. Several attractions and landmarks around the world participate in the Light It Up Blue campaign every year, including the Empire State Building, the Giza Pyramids, and the Sydney Opera House. It appears that less places have been doing this in recent years. When Donald Trump was president, the White House participated all 4 years. This is because of Trump's close ties to the Wright family, which I mentioned in a previous video. The neurodiversity movement responded to autism awareness with Autism Acceptance. The idea of Autism Acceptance was bounced around in online forums for a while, and then the Autism Acceptance Project was devised by Estee Clark in the late 2000s. This was a website that hosted resources that portrayed autism in a more positive light than what was more commonly seen. Then in 2011, Paula Durbin Westby built off of this work to devise Autism Acceptance Month. With this came many counter campaigns to light it up blue in the spirit of nothing about us without us. The most widespread one is red instead. One way this manifested was in 2015 with the Walkin Red campaign. People wore red clothing on April 2nd, and many took pictures of themselves holding signs with statements on it. That was a very common internet trend in the 2010s. Red was chosen for a few reasons. The first being that it's the opposite of blue, another lesser known reason being that red is a color that represents love. There was also lighted up gold. The earliest of this I can find is 2014. This one is kind of obvious, but it's derived from the chemical symbol for gold being AU. Autism and gold have been paired for a while, since at least the early 2000s. This is when it really caught on in particular circles, though. I'll talk more about it in the next chapter. And this one is my favorite. Tone It Down Taupe was started by Cassiana Sasamas and Manelli Martin. It's a parody of the Light It Up Blue campaign, and like many things before it, it reverses the rhetoric used by neurotypicals to describe what it's like to not be autistic. They use tone it down instead of light it up because many autistic people are sensitive to bright lights, and yeah, when you really think about it, the whole idea of light it up a certain color really feels like it was not made with autistic people in mind. Tone It Down Taupe also has a taupe colored ribbon with a pair of googly eyes, representing how neurotypicals love eye contact for some reason. The best thing about this campaign in particular is that the organizers behind it raised money to buy communication devices and AAC apps for autistic people who needed it. So not only does it cleverly turn the concept of autism awareness on its head, it also has a history of providing material help to autistic people. I think that's a winning combination. Okay, one last Speaks parody, NT Speaks. NT Speaks was a website that took the front page of Autism Speaks and slightly tweaked it. This was done by a 14-year-old with the alias of Kelly. Well, for whatever reason, Autism Speaks couldn't let this one slide and sued the person behind this. They did this to a minor. So Kelly had to take it down, sadly. It's still available on the web archive, uh, but this happened in the late 2000s, but I forgot to mention it in the last video, so here you go. The 2010s were huge for Asan. So previously, they were an all-volunteer organization. They grew enough to the point where they officially became a nonprofit in 2011. This means it took them 5 years of organizing to reach that status. Before then, they were operated by state chapters only. After gaining nonprofit status, they opened their central office in Washington, D.C., where other social justice nonprofits were also stationed, including disability-specific ones. At first, their office was in the same building as the National Council on Independent Living, NICL. Around 2012, they changed their logo to what it's known as now. I love this logo. It's so satisfying to look at. It reminds me of the logo for Aperture Science from the game Portal, except it's rainbow colored. It looks a lot like the logo for Picasa. They didn't want to use a puzzle piece as their logo, obviously, but they also didn't want to use any specific autism symbol, so not even the infinity symbol. I kind of like this better, if I'm being honest. Another thing ASAM worked on in the early 2010s was the Loud Hands project, which actually started out as an archive, much like mine did. Julia told me this after Autistic Archive launched. But there were too many logistical issues that made it hard for them to do it, so they made it an anthology of essays by autistic people instead. It is an absolutely lovely book, and since it's almost 10 years old, being published in 2012, it almost acts as a makeshift archive in and of itself. There are so many essays in this book that resonated with me deeply. I don't read books very often, though I have been reading more because of my advocacy work. But this is probably the singular book that has spoken to me the most. Many of the essays featured are truly eye opening, and it puts words to a lot of things I was feeling but was never able to describe. Many of Mel's essays are in Loud Hands, and I gravitated towards a lot of those. But I also gravitated towards Jim's retelling of ANI's history, as I discussed in the earlier videos. I highly recommend it to any autistic person. I own two copies of Loud Hands, actually. One was a holiday gift, another was sent to me by ASAN as part of ACI. That segues me into the next topic here, ACI, shorthand for Autism Campus Inclusion. This is a week-long leadership academy led by ASAN that is held every summer. They teach you about effective advocacy, particularly on college campuses, since the program is for autistic people enrolled in college and any other post-secondary education. You learn about the history of disability advocacy and get to talk to well-known self-advocates. It's a great experience that I learned so much from. I also really love the people I did it with, as well as a lot of the alumni of the program. ACI is a real gem of a program. It's usually in DC, but because of the pandemic, it was virtual in 2020 and 2021. Plans are for it to be held in person this year, at least for now. I did it in 2020, so that means I didn't get to go in person, unfortunately. I still had a great time, obviously, but it undoubtedly would have been better in person. One thing I can say, though, is that I have transcripts of all the sessions I attended, so I have a tangible record of most of the interactions I had at ACI, which would not be possible in person. ACI ASAN started holding annual galas in 2011 where they celebrated the highlights of autistic self-advocacy during the year. Many prominent figures in the neurodiversity and disability rights movement gather at these galas. I was able to attend the 2019 gala in person, and it was a mesmerizing experience. I got to meet many of my role models. I'd love to go again. If it wasn't already obvious, I love ASAN. Them and AWN are my favorite autism organizations, period. No single nonprofit can do or be everything, and this isn't to say either of them are perfect. But the work both of these organizations do is consistently of high quality. I'm hoping more national autistic self advocacy organizations eventually crop up with the same reach and quality as these two. The last Autry was held in 2013. This was also around the time ANI disbanded. I think there are a few reasons why this happened. One of them being that the neurodiversity movement was really starting to grow well beyond what ANI was doing. It became a lot harder to keep up with this. With the growth came growing pains. There was an Autry almost every year, and the organizers got more burnt out as they kept doing them. If A&I had been bigger, they would have been able to rotate leadership out more, but they simply didn't have that capacity as an organization. There started to be more factions in the neurodiversity movement that often conflicted with one another. It was also becoming more difficult to cater to everyone's access needs. There was always there was always infighting in the neurodiversity movement, but it was starting to get more divisive as the years went on. So with that came an uptick in drama at Autry. This isn't to say the good stuff was no longer there, just to say that there were rising tensions. There was one particular incident that was the last straw. I'm not going to mention it here, especially since I was not there and have no strong opinion on the matter. If you're really curious, Google Autry 2013. What I will say is I think there would have been a different final straw, even if that particular incident didn't transpire. Uh, if A&I wasn't already struggling to stay in operation, then one bad incident would not have ended everything. From what I've heard, this was the catalyst to a lot of infighting that is still happening to this day. So it's really sad that A&I had to go out like this, given how foundational of an organization it was. But I must reiterate that I don't think there is one single event, person, entity, or group to blame for this. Jim went off the grid after this happened and occasionally hops on Twitter, but not to talk about autism. The good news is that it was by no means the end of autistic led conferences, and certainly not the end of the neurodiversity movement. The Association for the Autistic Community was started in 2014 to organize autistic led conferences in the same vein as Autry. They've mainly organized Artspace, which is basically a continuation of Autry. Phil Schwartz is the one leading these efforts. The last Artspace was in 2019, and the next one is being planned. There hasn't been one since 2019 because of the pandemic. I look forward to attending the next one whenever it happens. Let's briefly talk about other autistic conferences that are similar to Autry. First off, there's Autism Haven. Autism Haven was first held in 2015 in Bola, Colorado. It was organized by Vicky Gleitz, also known as the Antique Autistic. She held it at her house mainly because the other gatherings, like Autry, were too expensive and far away from her, and other people she knew to attend. It seems like it was a genuinely good time for those in attendance. It was certainly smaller than Autry or Artspace in just about every way, but for some autistic people, that may be perhaps what they would rather have. No one setting works for everyone, autistic or not. Another conference that is almost as old as Autry is Autoscape. Autoscape is held in the UK. The first one was in 2005, and it's been held annually ever since, even during the start of the pandemic. They moved it to a virtual format for last year in 2020 and are doing a hybrid for this year. I do wonder why Artspace wasn't adapted to a virtual format as well. It could have to do with the difference in capacity between the organizers of each conference. It's also easy to get the two mixed up because there's a very slight difference in spelling. I will try to attend it this year, though if I do, it will certainly be virtual, since I do not have the time nor money to fly out to England. I will admit I need to do more research on Autscape. My research has been very Autry and Autscape focused, as well as very United States centric and central in general. There is a, there's a very obvious reason for that, being that I am from the United States, but I'm hoping to expand my research to cover the rest of the globe. A lot of key developments in this movement have been from the US, though certainly not all of it. It also has to do with available information. So now we have two remaining topics to discuss for this chapter, and both are quite significant. Both of them cover some very heavy topics, so proceed with caution. First off, we have Disability Day of Mourning. This was first observed in 2012. Zoe Gross, who was autistic, was the one to devise this concept. Previously, there were websites and blogs that memorialized disabled people murdered by caregivers, such as Joelle Smith's Murder of Autistics, The Record of the Dead by Feminists with Disabilities, and Not Dead Yet. An autistic man named George Hodgins was murdered by his parents, though the media focused on the supposed blight of his parents rather than the real tragedy, which was that an autistic person was killed. Zoe wanted to bring attention to this phenomenon and how it was just one example of a disturbing trend. That trend being people with disabilities being murdered by caregivers. and said murder being seen as heroic or mercy killing. She looked at the aforementioned websites and put together her own list. She also wanted to create a day where these names could be read out. The victims of filicide could be given proper recognition. So from that, Disability Day of Mourning was born. The first vigil was held in Washington, D.C., and brought together representatives of several disability organizations, though it was organized under Asan. Ever since, vigils have been held mainly across the US and Canada every year on March 1st. I feel like the work here speaks for itself. I really don't have anything to add. Hashtag Stop the Shock is an ongoing campaign started in the early 2010s. It revolves around a center in Canton, Massachusetts called the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center, or the JRC for short. The JRC has been in operation for more than 50 years and started as the Behavioral Research Institute in Providence, Rhode Island. It also had a campus in California and in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts location is the only one still open. It was started by Matthew Israel, a horrible man. He was a pupil of B.F. Skinner's and thought it was appropriate to open a center for people with the most disturbing behaviors. He thought if he could torture them enough, the behaviors would stop. What follows is a long and complicated history. One would wonder how a center like this continues to stay open. Well, it's a long story, but the extremely short version of it is that there is a whole group of parents who defend their offspring's placement in the center, and they have found several loopholes to help keep them open over the years. Many forms of aversives are used at the JRC and have been used, but the most infamous is a graduated electronic decelerator (GED), a backpack strapped to a person where strong electric shocks are administered whenever someone displays an unwanted behavior. They have a very broad definition for unwanted behavior, and I think what constitutes an unwanted behavior in the first place leaves room for this. Uh, they've shocked people for refusing to take off a jacket, for screaming, stimming, a number of other things. The residents at JRC cover a wide range of ages and disabilities. Most of them are people of color, and that is not by accident. The evils of this institution are well documented and have been known for decades. What really mobilized people was a leaked security camera video of Andre McCollins being strapped to a table and shocked, with him screaming desperately. I am not showing that footage here. Many self advocates in the disability community were outraged by this and decided to take action. This included in person protests. This includes outside the center of itself, outside the Food and Drug Administration's building, and at hearings in the state of Massachusetts. People from ASAN, ADAPT, and various other disability self-advocacy organizations have been organizing events in the name of Stopping the Shock for more than a decade now. They've tried getting the most infamous thing they do banned, that being the shock devices, though the end goal is to close the JRC entirely. The JRC claims to have changed their procedures and that they haven't given the GEDs to newer students and whatever other excuses. Though I don't find anything they say, though I find anything they say hard to believe. Israel is no longer involved with them, but their atrocities are the same. I want to give a shout out to Lydia Brown and Shane Newmeyer because they've both done so much work over the years to put an end to this. A lot of great work. I hope that one day they will bear the fruit of their labor. Here are more pictures of Stop the Shock protests. So let me get a few things clear about the JRC, because these are all things that must be discussed when discussing it. The JRC utilizes principles of applied behavior analysis. I've talked plenty about ABA in these videos, and there's more where that came from. But the ABA JRC uses is the most pure, raw form of it. Many behavior analysts will wave this away and say, oh no, this is an extreme example. I'd never do this. I don't doubt the statement. However, one must really ask, if this is as bad as it gets, what does it look like in more subtle forms? Why is it that the flagship conference for their field, the ABAI, hosts these people every year to talk about the effectiveness of the shock devices? I think that if you're continuing to exist in this field, you're allowing things like this to continue happening. And even if it's not literal physical torture, it can be just as bad. Mel wrote about this. The people at the JRC started with the same good intentions as anyone in the field of ABA or in general disability service provision. What desensitized them to the point of not just allowing, but administering these methods? I think a lot of it has to do with the socialization that happens within these fields. It rarely leads to something as extreme as the JRC, but the JRC is certainly a culmination of that, much like how Willowbrook was the culmination of all the problems institutionalization creates. I mentioned it was no accident that most of the students here are people of color. People of color with disabilities are among the most dehumanized in society. In fact, disability, particularly intellectual disability, is something used to justify racism. They're much more likely to end up in juvenile detention centers, alternative schools, institutions, and of course, jails and prisons. This is because of how their bodies and minds are deliberately dehumanized, and they are not given access to the same quality service as their white peers. One more smaller tidbit here. Yes, it's true that Autism Speaks let the JRC exhibit at one of their walks in 2013. How they let it happen is beyond me, but one thing that makes it even more perplexing is that in March 2012, they condemned the torture that was happening after the footage of Andre McCollins broke out. This walk was in November of 2013, nearly 2 years later. It really calls into question what their real position on the JRC is. Do they perhaps denounce them and then support them depending on when it's convenient for them? One must ask. Thank you for watching. There was certainly a lot to discuss here. I could definitely make whole separate videos about many of the things covered in this chapter. So now we're almost at the modern day when it comes to neurodiversity, and there's still much to go over. With that, I will see you next time.